Cuba. Although Cuba is only 90 miles away from the tip of Florida, we tend not to know much about it, except that they keep classic cars running. The U.S. government restricts the travel of Americans to Cuba as part of the trade embargo imposed by the U.S. government in 1960, 50 years ago. So how did I get there? The U.S. State Department grants permits for certain organizations to take groups of Americans to Cuba. The organizations contract with approved travel agencies in Cuba to arrange the itinerary and activities for a cultural visit. I wanted to see it for myself, so I went to Cuba in March 2012 with Road Scholar, an American tour company. As we go through, notice how many connections the U.S. has with Cuba. Road Scholar gave us a wish list of items that could be used by the synagogues, art and music schools, and community centers on our schedule, in case we wanted to bring gifts. My roommate Tony brought 2 bags of gifts, 2 suitcases of gifts, donated by her church for the synagogues we would visit. Aspirin, toiletries, cough medicine, baseballs, a few toys, and other things. Another woman brought about half a suitcase of medical supplies, donated by her doctor ex-husband. Others brought other items from the suggested list. I brought leggings, shirt, and shorts that could be worn by teens for dance or street wear. We stayed 4 nights in Havana and made day trips to Guanabacoa and Regla, a center of Santeria worship, then drove southeast to Playa Girón, site of the Bay of Pigs invasion, and on to Cienfuegos, where we stayed 3 nights. From Cienfuegos, we visited Trinidad with its traditional architecture, and Santa Clara, a base during the Civil War that deposed Batista. We were a group of 24 plus 1 Cuban-American woman named Cookie, who was our guide, administrator, and helper throughout the trip. Havana's Hotel Nacional, in English, the National Hotel, was designed by a New York firm. It features an eclectic mix of architectural styles. It opened in 1930 when Cuba was a prime travel destination for Americans, long before the U.S. embargo. During Prohibition in the United States, Havana became a paradise for those who wanted good rum and fine cigars. Among the Hotel Nacional's first famous guests were artists, actors, athletes, and writers, such as Frank Sinatra, Ava Gardner, Mickey Mantle, Rocky Marciano, Errol Flynn, and Ernest Hemingway. Nat King Cole has both a photo and a bronze sculpture. They are pictured in photo collages on the walls of the Celebrity Bar Hall of the hotel. The hotel's reputation as a deluxe host was bolstered by patrons such as Winston Churchill, who is pictured with a Cuban cigar. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor and innumerable heads of state and monarchs slept here. More recently, Minnesota Governor Jesse Ventura stayed at the hotel while visiting Cuba on a trade mission in 2002. The hotel's grandeur has faded somewhat, but is being revived as Cuba seeks tourism as a source of income. The grounds behind the hotel are well designed, with a pool, green lawn, and curved sidewalks and benches. The sidewalk runs down to a cafe area that overlooks the Malecon, the promenade at the ocean front. Waves rolled in strongly and splashed on the barrier wall. The Malecon is a popular gathering spot for locals, especially in the evenings. There's a monument at this strip of the Malecon for victims of the Maine, a U.S. battleship that exploded and sank in the Havana harbor in February 1898. It was sent to protect U.S. interests during the Cuban revolt against Spain, and the cause of the explosion was never clear. The phrase, "Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain," became a rallying cry, and although it was not a direct cause for action, it served as a catalyst for the Spanish-American War later that year. The guide said there were efforts underway to get the U.S. and Cuba to cooperate on raising the ship from the bottom of the harbor. People and culture. One morning I walked through the residential neighborhood near the Nacional Hotel. I stood and sat at a corner and watched people. Children walked to school. Their primary school down the block was in an old, large house. On the street, there were mothers with children, adults calling to each other, men or women looking outdoors and windows, motorbikes and cars. One woman looking over the railing of an upstairs balcony waved to me. It was a busy but not bustling place. When we arrived in Cienfuegos, we were treated to a choral concert in the museum auditorium. The young adult voices were clear and bright, almost angelic. They sang 10 songs, some old traditional, one U.S., Shenandoah in English, one Venezuelan, and some modern. Also in Cienfuegos, we visited a public school that combines academics and arts. It was the Beny More Art School, named after the 1930s musician. He came from Cienfuegos. In one room, we were serenaded by 9 to 11-year-old boys and girls on the piano, boys on classical guitar, and then a chorus of older boys and girls. It was interesting to see this chorus of young performers after seeing and hearing the adult chorus at the museum. Their songs and singing style and choreographed movements were very similar. At the Beny More School, we went into a classroom with younger children, learning the musical scale. And then into a room set up as a dance studio, where young girls in tights and leotards danced barefoot in modern style. In another room, a teen boy and girl danced for us, and we met the instructors. Further on, we saw students and their work in visual arts. Driving cross-country offers a chance to see the surrounding scenery and glimpse the lives of the people and rural-urban differences. The economy and agriculture. Wages in Cuba are set at very low levels by the central government and are supplemented by food ration coupons. Cuba's average per capita income is 448 pesos a month, or $20 at the official exchange rate. Measured on a purchasing power parity basis, considering what they have to buy and the prices they pay, Cuba's per capita income is $6,000 a year. By comparison, it is $8,000 in the Dominican Republic, $11,000 in Brazil, and $14,000 in Mexico. Cuba ranks high on the United Nations social indicators of human development. In education, adult literacy in Cuba is 100%, and average schooling is 10 years. In health, child mortality rates in Cuba are a low 6 per 1,000 live births, and life expectancy at birth is 79 years. These are strong accomplishments at a par with developed countries. The paradox, said Richard Feinberg of the Brookings Institution in his November 2011 study, is that the Cuban government has effectively endowed its citizens with abundant human capital, but has sadly left them without the tools or incentives to fully realize their acquired talents. It is no wonder there is a frantic search for jobs that offer privileged access to foreign currency. The other alternative for those with portable skills is immigration. A still youthful alumnus of the prestigious Lenin High School in Havana calculated that about half of his graduating class was now working overseas. Cuba's primary crops continue to be sugarcane and, to a lesser extent, tobacco, aimed at export of sugarcane, rum made from sugarcane, and cigars. After the fall of the Soviet Union and loss of Russian support in the 1990s, the Cuban government converted Soviet-style state farms into semi-private cooperatives, although the state retained land ownership, crop assignment, and price control. After meeting their obligations to state wholesalers, farmers are permitted to sell some of their production in farmers' markets at decontrolled prices. Fresh fruits and vegetables became more available. Residents buy meat and produce in food stores and in local farmers' markets. Most of Cuba's food is imported, about 80% in 2008 after a destructive hurricane season, and an estimated 60 to 70% in 2011. Increasing food production is a major goal for the Cuban government. The 50-year-old U.S. embargo restricts most trade between Cuba and the U.S., but in 2000 it began to allow the sale of food and medicines for cash. The U.S. has been one of Cuba's top 10 trading partners for a number of years. In 2008, Cuba became Alabama's #1 export market for poultry, with 50,000 tons of chicken heading there from Mobile every year. When other countries began selling Cuba food on credit in 2008, the U.S. lost a lot of market share. In 2011, Brazil became Cuba's #1 supplier of food and agricultural products. To broaden our view beyond agriculture, we can note that Cuba has been bartering with Venezuela for several years. Cuba provides doctors and other medical personnel to Venezuela, and in return, Venezuela provides oil to Cuba. Obviously, the U.S. and Cuba are not the only players in the Cuban economy. Again, quoting from Richard Feinberg's study, since the collapse of its former patron, the Soviet Union, a resilient Cuba has dramatically diversified its international economic relations. Spanish firms manage many of the expanding hotel chains in Cuba that cater to 2.5 million international tourists each year. A Canadian company jointly owns mining operations that ship high-priced nickel to Canada and China. In the next few years, China is poised to spend billions of dollars building a large petrochemical complex at Cienfuegos. A Brazilian firm will modernize the Mariel port so it can accommodate very large container ships transiting the newly widened Panama Canal. Petroleum companies from 10 or more countries have lined up to explore for deep-sea oil in Cuban waters of the Gulf of Mexico. Feinberg says, the main constraint slowing the Cuban economy is not U.S. sanctions, even though they have hit hard. Rather, it is Cuba's own outdated economic model of central planning inherited from the Soviet Union. Let's talk about architecture. A local architect, historian, professor talked to us about restoration work on buildings in Old Havana and on Cuba's potential for development. When someone asked the professor if he thought the U.S. embargo would be lifted soon, the professor said he thinks the embargo will not be lifted with the stroke of a pen, but is being dismantled bit by bit. Most of the areas being restored in Havana are public buildings and historic sites, in hopes that tourism will generate more funds for development. Some Cubans with money are now renovating their homes, but there are no zoning regulations to guide and limit changes to be made. For many, the money to improve living conditions comes from relatives in the U.S. Old Havana's buildings and plazas are good examples of the restoration being done slowly and carefully. Eusebio Leal was hired as a city preservationist in 1967, and he stayed on the job. The area of Old Havana, Vieja Habana, was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1982. In the midst of cutbacks in 1993, Leal proposed that his office be given authority to generate and use its own income, and it happened. Starting with a budget from the state of $1 million, they restored a small hotel, 3 small restaurants, and a set of houses in ruins. The hotel was the Ambos Mundos, where Ernest Hemingway is said to have written part of For Whom the Bell Tolls. According to a Washington Post article in May 2012, Leal's operation has grown to include 16 hotels, a tour company, restaurants, museums, a radio station, and more. In 2011, revenues were $119 million, profits $23 million. Leal reinvests half of the profits in new preservation work, and half in social programs such as establishing health clinics, schools, and senior living centers in the old city. Now the city historian, Leal's intent is to create an infrastructure for daily life to continue despite the tourism that will come. He says, the city must live essentially around its people. Tourists will overwhelm the place. That's why it's important for people to live there and work there, to create spaces of silence where there aren't tourist installations, but there are real neighborhoods. And even in the most visited places, put schools, little hospitals. We are trying to put up curtains in the path of the wave. About an hour's drive east of Cienfuegos is Trinidad City, a town that has maintained its colonial architecture almost by accident. The main plaza in Trinidad is the historic center of the town, declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1988. The buildings surrounding the central plaza date from the 18th and 19th centuries, when trade in sugar from the nearby beautiful valley of sugarcane fields and mills, and the slaves who worked them, brought great riches to the area. Many of the buildings surrounding the central square belonged to the wealthy landowners of the city. When the trade in sugar diminished and the slave trade ended in the mid-19th century, Trinidad became a backwater. Because little building work was done until the 1950s, many of the historic buildings and streets were preserved, especially around the central square. Today, most of these houses are home to museums. Religion in Cuba. People in Cuba have a measure of religious freedom, even though they live under a communist government. The measure of freedom is increased since the fall of the Soviet Union and with the visits of 2 popes in recent years. Most people in Cuba identify themselves as Roman Catholic, possibly 60%, though few attend Mass. Some practice Santeria, an Afro-Cuban religion of saint worship, and some practice a blend of Catholicism and Santeria. We visited 2 Jewish synagogues and talked to their leaders, and we visited a Santeria museum. Our guide, Cookie, said Rhodes Scholar had asked, but the Christian churches in Cuba declined to participate with the tours. We walked through several Catholic churches, but we didn't see a Protestant church. There's an estimated 5% of Protestants in Cuba. Santeria. We took a day trip just outside Havana to Guanabacoa, an area traditionally strong in the Santeria religion. We went through the small Santeria museum with a guide, and then watched a performance of ritualistic music and dance. Santeria is an Afro-Cuban religion of saint worship. Practices were brought from West Africa by people whom the Spanish brought to Cuba as slaves. To add importance to the African origin practices, Santeria believers selected Christian Catholic saints to correspond to or correlate with African saints. Practices could be to do harm or to do good. Our guide said the crucifix was part of the setup when good was to be done, and was omitted when harm was to be done. Certain plants and animals were used in the practices. The guide didn't say, but I thought of it as a kind of voodoo, like sticking pins in a doll that looks like the person to be hurt. The museum guide said that novitiates in the Santeria religion wear only white for the first year, and that deep cobalt blue is a color of significance for the religion. The Santeria music and dance performance involved 3 female and 1 male dancers, drummer and rhythm players, plus a male and a female lead singer. The Church of the Black Madonna. Driving a short distance from Guanabacoa, we walked through the town of Regla and visited a Catholic church built in 1850. The church sits a block from the water, across the bay from Havana Old Town. Here parishioners pay homage to the Black Virgin of Regla, patron saint of sailors, protector of fishermen and small children. She is the Catholic counterpart to Yemaya, the African goddess of the sea in the Santeria religion. Walking through the park, we encountered some friendly faces. San Lazaro. About 10 miles from Havana, we visited San Lazaro Catholic Church. It was named after St. Lazarus, patron saint of the poor. The schedule says, thousands of Cubans make the trek here every year on December 17, the Saint's Day. Some pilgrims make the trek barefoot or drag stones behind them. A hospital next to the church is run by nuns. Che Guevara, a revolutionary who was a medical doctor, was instrumental in starting this hospital. The hospital specialized in the care of lepers, but also deals with other health concerns. Jewish Synagogue. We visited the Jewish Patronato Synagogue and Pharmacy in the Vedado section of Havana. The young man who was our guide is one of the synagogue's worship leaders. There are no rabbis in Cuba. They left after the revolution in 1959. A rabbi from Chile comes monthly and for weddings and bar mitzvahs. At other times they have lay leaders for their twice-monthly services. The synagogue had a small library and a large multipurpose room where classes and social activities are held for youth and adults, and a large worship room sanctuary. The synagogue was built in the mid-1950s by Havana's newly affluent Jews and has become both a cultural and religious center for Havana's Jews. The Jewish Joint Distribution Committee maintains an office in the building, which distributes medicine and other goods and materials throughout Cuba. There are few Jews outside Havana, not enough to support a synagogue. In Cienfuegos City, we visited a synagogue and a private residence. From the sidewalk, we walked up the steep tiled steps into a medium-sized living room, set up for us with rows of folding chairs. Several Jewish families of about 24 people worship and study here. The woman of the house, a group leader, talked and answered questions. They have no building and no Torah, scriptures, but they have a small library of books, and they gather here every 2 weeks to study and worship. They organize activities for children and youth. We had brought gifts, as described earlier, and the guide presented them. Several in the group, particularly Jewish couples, contributed money for the synagogue. One Jewish woman in the group sang a song in Yiddish, which she may have written. It was a very moving experience. Santa Clara and the people. Santa Clara is a town in the north-south center of the island of Cuba, several miles from Cienfuegos. Santa Clara is significant because of its history in the Revolution. It was a base for Ernesto Che Guevara, the doctor revolutionary from Argentina who joined with Fidel and others to drive out Cuba's dictator, Batista. There is a large memorial here to Che and other revolutionary heroes. However, I was more impressed with the people of the Santa Clara Senior Club, which was our most fun people-to-people event. A representative talked about their activities, and then we saw some of their arts and crafts. One woman was crocheting. A woman sang a beautiful song accompanied by a man on classical guitar. A couple demonstrated a local traditional dance for us. Then more people from their group joined and chose partners from our group, and so on. Our hosts were so friendly, although few spoke English, and only a few of our group speak Spanish well enough to converse. Language is not always required. The sun rises, and it is a new day.
Pensamiento, dile a fragancia que yo la quiero, que no la puedo olvidar. Ella vive en mi alma, anda y dile así, dile que pienso en ella, aunque no piense en mí. Dile que pienso en ella, aunque no piense en mí.